Good morning, Adrian. How are you today?
Good morning, Pete. Yeah, quite good, thank you.
Excellent. Well, the sun's shining here in West Sussex. It doesn't appear to be shining in your computer room, but hopefully you're equally happy with the weather this week.
That's good. My existence is usually in a darkened room, Pete.
Okay, that used to be me, but not anymore. I'd like today to talk about threat and risk assessment and what I perceive to be the reluctance of many organizations to take this sort of structured approach to their cyber defense. And to give us a framework to chat about, I've got just a couple of slides that I'd like to whiz through that I would use in explaining to an audience the right approach to being cyber resilient. And then maybe we can talk about your and my experiences and why we think people are reluctant to take this approach.
That's great. So it's putting more of a real world spin on the actual frameworks that we've talked about in previous episodes.
Yeah, as usual, succinctly put. Thank you. Okay, let me share my screen. Hopefully this will work okay. And this is the first slide. It just helps people understand the lexicon of terminology that we use. So the black text is the words that we would generally use in talking to a technical audience. The red, trying to make it a little more consumable for the non-technical person. And really, my steps when I'm talking to a client are, we need to understand who it is you're facing, who the enemy is, what they're trying to achieve, how they might attack you, what they're after, which may, in many cases, seem to be obvious to people, but I suspect isn't, how that organization is defending itself, and whether or not it's actually able to detect a successful breach and limit the impact of it. So that's my sort of, these are the words we use. Then I go through 3 steps. 1, identifying the threats. Who is it that wants to access your information? Why and what methods will they use? Then what are the information assets in your business? The ones that are really critical or which would cause severe embarrassment if they were to be breached, or would cost you money if they were no longer available, or in the worst case, of course, maybe even cause the organization to fail. And it's not just what those information assets are, it's where they're located, which in some cases, as we know, is more than one place, and who's responsible for them. And we can talk about that in more detail. And then the 3rd step, which is thinking about vulnerabilities, is understanding who has access to that information in the business and in, of course, partners and third parties, and how they're currently protected. So those are the 3 introductory slides. Step 1, the threats. Step 2, the assets. Step 3, the vulnerabilities. So with that as a context, my experience is that many organizations will listen to that sort of explanation, but I feel they're often very reluctant to put that work in to establish that groundwork, if you will, before they spend money and effort on improving their cyber resilience. Is this something you find as well?
It's something that I think it's even a prequel to that, is them understanding what those, again, quite simplified explanations that you put in there actually mean. And to a lot of clients, buying a boxed product, be it a hardware, be it a software product, or even be it as a service product, a lot of people really think they can just buy something in and then deploy, where there is a lot more thought, as you're explaining there, that needs to go behind that process of even starting to actually look at those.
Yeah. So I'm being a little contentious then. Is the industry, when we're thinking about vendors and managed service providers and so on, is it sort of I was going to say brainwashing, but marketing to its audience that they can just give their money over, give their responsibilities over to that service provider or that equipment supplier, and then, oh, we don't have to think about cyber anymore.
Absolutely. I mean, people, especially in more recent years, are using cybersecurity as a great buzzword and in fact, a tool to try and leverage people to say, right, this is really complex and you don't know what you're actually doing. So buy our product and you're already there. Whereas the reality of that is with the likes of you and I are actually going in and explaining it to boards, to executive teams, to senior leadership teams in plain English. Actually get them to understand what the capabilities are, what their own capabilities are around that. It's not just an IT problem. Your IT department won't be able to solve it for you or buy in a solution to that from a third party. It requires that full top-down approach of thinking about, as you put in those slides, what in terms of the files that they hold within the information assets that they hold are the most valuable to them. What are the actual physical assets that they may need to protect, and that can include their staff and their different departments, and in terms of what they have. Looking at what I term as the information governance of that set of information assets, be they the people, the files, servers, cloud-based systems, whatever they have deployed, and looking at then, as you say, the attack vectors, how people might access those or why they would want to actually access those information assets, and then who even internally has access to those information assets. Which again is vitally important. But plain and simply, what is most valuable to that company, and starting in with that real basic level of defining what they think is most important to them.
Yeah, I think, I do believe that a large number of organizations understand the concept of corporate resilience. They will think about the threats to their business that might come from competitors, threats to their business that might come from disruptions to the supply chain, threats to the business that may come from, well, for example, a pandemic, of course, and how that would reshape pretty much every business. And whilst they may not be perfectly prepared for that, they nonetheless feel capable to respond to that and to re-envisage their corporate model to cope with those changes, to develop new services, to develop new products and offerings, to continue to allow the business to survive and even to grow. And yet, and whilst all businesses, bar a very tiny minority, are fundamentally dependent on IT and the information that the IT carries, they don't seem to consider that the same effort should be put in to protecting those information assets through this sort of threat and risk analysis as they might if the threat came from a more real world source. The cyber.
Yeah, and yeah, that is a good almost segue into a business continuity that people seem to forget about during the pandemic. Certainly, both during and post-pandemic, what I know you've seen as well during that period is where a lot of people have changed away from what is their normal business model because they've needed to adjust, rightly so, for the actual pandemic to be able to survive and for their businesses to actually survive and their organizations to actually still operate effectively. Yet what seemed to be lost there was that whole secure side of things, and then the continuity of what they'd originally planned for hasn't then been reimagined or re-envisaged because they've forgotten about their risk assessments from old. They've got a whole new load of risks that they hadn't assessed for. And it's only perhaps come around because it's the annual review time of a risk assessment roadmap. And then it's like, oh, well, actually, yeah, we've got a whole new load of risks that we haven't thought about. Or they've just approached that risk assessment map or plan exercise as they had originally and not considered a lot of the new threats or new risks that they have in that.
Do you think that a lot of business leaders and management are, in a way, more comfortable dealing with things tactically than strategically? I mean, that sort of having, we've got a really, really big challenge here in having to shift everyone to remote working or to take our business more online than in person. Those sorts of things are quite exciting and stimulating and very much like being at war in a way. And all of those things,
very much.
They inspire people to act. And yet, this stuff looks, this is boring. This is like all this blooming strategic thinking. This is like auditors and people we don't like.
Yeah, but also from that strategy side of things, especially with a top-down only approach, people like to plan strategies and then they don't follow through or test those plans. So again, very much like the risks that they face, again, they could strategize around a pandemic, but then they haven't necessarily looked at the bigger picture because they haven't deployed that strategy effectively throughout the organization and haven't involved the right people at the right times. And that's why people like you and I run things like red team exercises, because it effectively looks at that attack surface, looks at those risks and the maps that the business thinks they've identified, and usually they think they've identified them all. And we relook at that. And we relook at that risk analysis and say, actually, you've got a big hole here or a big hole there in terms of maybe even a physical access issue. Especially during the pandemic, there was so much more where people were not in the office, and yet you had people walking into buildings and just wandering around all over the place without being challenged because there weren't the amount of people there to challenge them.
Yeah.
And this is why we run exercises like these, to not only analyze what people have got in place, but to challenge their thinking.
So that's interesting, actually. If I can take that thought and play with it for a minute, I think maybe what we're saying is it might be a really good idea to do a modest red team exercise first, just to focus people's attention and get them to understand where their strategic structure is weak or missing, rather than my very engineering approach, which says, well, we build an information asset register, we look at all the threats and risks, we identify the ones that are most likely to affect your business, and then we look at the vulnerabilities. Maybe we need to turn that on its head and say, build a red team exercise that's comparatively generic based on what we know to be typical vulnerabilities in typical businesses, whatever that means, and use that as an attention getter to then promote the idea of a proper strategic framework being built to protect the business.
Absolutely. I mean, there are some instances where we have done similar things, and it's produced a lot of amazing results in terms of raising that awareness, which is where I think our sticking point comes, when people within the organizations think they've already identified all of their risks. So performing that exercise first, and yes, we do it in the right way with our white hat on as it is, and we're getting the right permissions to do so from those top levels. But again, then involving all the people that need to be in that red team exercise, and especially the debriefs of those, and then consequentially some of the tabletop exercises that we do following that, is vitally important. It's no good just involving that executive board or that leadership team. It needs to involve all the relevant parties so that everybody plays a key part in that whole plan.
Yeah. So this needs to be something that is, from at least one person's perspective, championed from within, doesn't it? Because you can't turn up on site and say, right, we're going to do a red team exercise today. No. You need to have at least one individual inside the business who is on board with the whole principle. And
absolutely.
Yeah, okay. So that remains a significant challenge for many cybersecurity and information security professionals employed on the defensive side, doesn't it? Getting the budget to do that, for example, is that a challenge?
With the advent of a lot more insurance type cover over cybersecurity, I find that is approached more readily at board level with those pieces in mind. Similar to what we were talking about with the state schools and multi-academy trusts RPA schemes that we briefly talked about last week, there are criteria now to cyber insurance cover that you need to meet, again, from any size of business, from a small business, a school, a charity, a large commercial organization. You have to meet these criteria to be able to get that cover, and you have to be able to prove what you've done. And so as a way of introducing that exercise through that piece, it is a must. And again, when you're talking with financial organizations, you also have the rules that the FCA throw in.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, okay, so that's interesting. So assuming the business is sufficiently cyber literate to have some form of cybersecurity or cyber insurance in place, then it may well be that were they to actually bother to read the rules of that contract in sufficient detail, they'd find that this is exactly the sort of thing they should be doing in order to satisfy the insurers as well as, or instead of, their own management. That
is definitely a case of read the small print.
Yeah.
Because there are so many people who think, oh, that's okay, I've paid for cyber cover, so I don't need to worry about that side of things. And especially micro businesses that I come across, small businesses included, they think that even just taking that small elements of Cyber Essentials Plus will give them that cover. And yes, you do get an element of free cover. I say free, it is included in that package of Cyber Essentials, but there are criteria around that. And even though you may have passed your Cyber Essentials or Cyber Essentials Plus for that year, that's only as good as then the next change that you make. Which goes back to the episode we played last time. Again, if you haven't watched it, please go back and watch it, viewers and listeners, because there are essentials in there that are really important to note. Yes, it's not a panacea, but if you make changes after that fact, then you're essentially changing what you've already got covered. So you may come to claim against something if you have a cyber attack or some sort of phishing attempt, or even an internal issue where you've had a breach from those sides of the actual attack vectors, and you may not be covered because you've changed significantly some of the things that you were covered for, or answered the questions about during those exercises. And the same goes for even the ISO 27001 as well. There are big elements in there where if you've made major changes, you need to inform them, and you, at times, if they're significant enough, you need to retest.
Yeah, it's an extraordinarily good point. I think a lot of businesses may not be thinking about that, and may not perhaps have anybody overtly responsible for thinking about that either. So I think that's an enormously useful learning point to come out of today's discussion. Thank you. And I guess if you're someone responsible for cybersecurity in a business and you're struggling to get attention, you're struggling to get budget, you're struggling to get buy-in to the right approach, maybe that's the place to start, to have a look at the insurance cover, to have a look at the whatever accreditations the business has, whether that's ISO 27000 or Cyber Essentials or whatever, and to take the time to go through the rules and the contracts and establish whether in fact things have changed, which given all the pandemic outputs they're almost certain to have done, and to use that as a justification for some form of red team exercise, and to use that as a lever to a more strategic approach.
Absolutely, and following on from our last two episodes, it covers that whole NIST criteria and framework around that cybersecurity part. If you're following those same principles, again, you will know that things need to change, and if they do change, then you have elements of re-examining what your risks are.
Yeah. Perversely, of course, a good threat and risk analysis would have things like your insurance, legal issues, the certifications as potential threats, because that's what they are. So hopefully a business that goes through this process will then, in effect, secure itself for the future by building that thinking into their regular processes that are part of a cyber resilience structure, and won't be wrong-footed by it in future.
Absolutely, and again, business continuity plans are all well and good. Cyber resilience is an essential part of that, and a disaster recovery plan is also really important in there. But how often do they test it? How often is that actually run through and tested in terms of, does it work?
Yeah.
Have I got all the bits I need to in that? Have I got the right asset information sheet? And am I protecting those things that actually might be new in terms of that critical information that I need to run my organization?
I remember how shocked our ISO auditor was many years ago when he asked me for our information asset register, and I was able to show it to him. That was a surprise in the first place. And then the columns that we had in that, identifying, who was responsible, who had access, what sort of access they had, how often we audited it, how often we tested it, and so on. And I would be in seventh heaven if the majority of organizations out there understood how to take this approach. And maybe the lesson from today is that we need to take a more tactical approach to encourage the business to understand why it needs a more strategic approach. So again, it's a change of thinking really for someone who's spent their life embedded in cybersecurity to find a way to get the attention of someone who really doesn't care about security at all, and get them to change their thinking with something more tactical and attractive rather than the boring strategic pictures.
Yeah, but once you have these information assets and this background work that you've done to identify all these bits that some people may think are niceties, but we think of them as essentials, because we have identified a lot of these things in many different organizations. But you can then use those to then program in these other services that we talked about at the start of that place to get a nice bit of hardware that helps you automate some of these things to help protect you, to help prevent a lot of these things. But you have to know the information beforehand to actually put the right information in. It's the old adage of garbage in, garbage out. Or if you haven't got the right information in the first place, then you're not going to get a lot out of it.
Yeah, super. Thank you, Adrian. That's been so useful. I personally have learned quite a few things from you this morning.
Me too. That's why these sessions are so great.
Yeah, they are. Thanks, my friend. I look forward very much to our next chat, and I hope you have an excellent day. Take care, my friend.
Bye-bye.
Bye.